I see Karen's hand and then Lou so far. Karen?
Yeah, I like what you said about all the ancients. The first thing you said, emotions are cognitive. So I summarized that with the old metaphor that I learned probably from my mother long before philosophy. The emotions are the horses and reason is the driver. So reason is somehow should be in control. But what about you're speaking to somebody of today? And for many people today, I think people would say that reasons are emotional. They flipped it. And so I feel bad, therefore you are wrong.
Right. Yeah.
Or they are dealing with somebody that operates in that way.
Yeah.
And it's a very, maybe in some context, you can clue into reason as a controller, but there's an awful lot of people that operate by the I feel bad, you are wrong method.
Yeah. So there's a couple things to say about that. I often will use a distinction between reasoning and rationalization, where reasoning is at least something that, is relatively free from the emotions, although we can certainly, like you could say, emotions could work like premises or starting points or things like that. But there's still like some, ability for whatever we're working with to say, oh no, this doesn't make sense, or we need to think this out better. Rationalization is sort of like that Humean reason can only be the slave of the passions line that not even Hume believes, but which a lot of people do exemplify and spout, right? Where you're like you said, I feel bad, and now I look for a reasoning process by which I can say that you're a bad person, or we should, throw you in jail, or pick whatever else you want. And can we always tell the difference between these? No, not always. But with training, we can get better at doing less of this rationalization, where it's essentially just being driven by the emotions, and then do more practical reasoning. But the emotions, they're not cognitive as such. They have a cognitive dimension or component, is what all of these ancient thinkers thought. So there is, like when you get angry, like Seneca thinks, if you get really, really angry, there's not much we can do with you, right? And you're going to say things that to you seem reasonable, but that's part of the problem with anger. It subverts our rationality, right? But you can come back to somebody later on and say, all right, what was going on with you? You said these things, you did these things. What was your thought process? Let's examine this together. And that's using rationality, right? Although they could easily veer off and get ticked off at you. Who are you to question my reasoning processes, right? So there is an interplay between them. And it's not a perfect response, but to make a distinction between practical reasoning, and I think it's important to include like some qualifier like practical in there to make it sound better. This is pure rhetoric. And then rationalization, that can often be quite helpful for people to see it and be like, oh yeah, I'm doing this other thing that's not so good, which is a misuse of my rational faculties, right? And the last thing I'll say about this is, if you don't have much practice with this and everybody else around you is doing that sort of thing, it's going to be really, really hard not to, as a knee-jerk response, go into rationalization. And then you will probably think, well, everybody does this, right? This is the way everybody is. But just because, just because ordinary people do that, and because some experts out there are like, we're never really reasoning, it's always emotionally driven, that doesn't make it true. So
it's just difficult to deal with a lot of those people who do that. They're common today. The feelings drive everything. They're common out. There are lots of people out there.
I think it's always been common, though. I mean, that's one of the things. The reason why these philosophers are examining anger and many other emotions is because people are screwed up in their own time and culture with them, right? we're maybe worse off in terms of accessing useful resources in our culture, right? Because we sometimes get steered to people who are like, oh, it's all just about feelings, tell us what your feelings are. Don't think about it so much, which is not a good approach. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to bring some attention to time. We only have 8 minutes left, and we have 3 hands up. I have Lou, Ashwini, and then Carolyn. So the questioners and the answerer try to be mindful of the time. Keep it a little on the short side. Lou?
Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. I see why you have so many hits. You're a very good speaker. Very effective speaker. So I have more questions than I can ask. Just let me say what you've done is to remind us that there are more resources than just the Stoics. I mean, positive psychology, but you've given us a very rich menu from the ancient Western world, and that's helpful. I wonder if you have encountered the Mark Twain school of anger management, because he wrote angry letters, and he said that what he'd do is when he got angry, he'd write an angry letter and put it on his mantelpiece for 3 days. And if after 3 days he was still angry, he'd mail it. Otherwise, he'd burn it. So we lost most of them to the flames, but a couple of them survived. There's one famous one where an enemy of his died, and he said, I couldn't attend the funeral, but I wrote them a nice letter saying I approved of it. I mean, this is probably very sadistic and cruel, but also funny, right? So it put me in mind of the Sicilian bandit joke, where the Sicilian bandit's on his deathbed and the priest comes to give him the last rites and says, my son, now is the perfect time to forgive your enemies. And the bandit says, Father, I cannot, for I've killed them all. So that's the example for the client who wants revenge on the whole world, So have you thought about also, or maybe you have, looked at more contemporary resources for creating space and managing anger with your clients who need that?
Yeah, I mean, I will draw upon some things from, so cognitive behavior therapy and rational motive behavior therapy. So cognitive approaches on the one side, and oftentimes they're using stuff that comes from or is similar to Stoicism. And then there's lots of interesting observations that you can find, not just in psychology, but in literature. Dostoevsky has some cool remarks on anger in The Underground Man. And so when I find they're useful, I bring them up. The other person who I actually think has got a lot to contribute on anger is Thomas Aquinas, who is bringing together all these things, but it was a little bit outside of the scope of, this talk. But he's got this wonderful idea of anger as being a response to the difficult good. And that helps put things in perspective. As to the, writing letters, I mean, people do this with emails, right, too? And sometimes they fire them off without meaning to, which is always a catastrophe. But I kind of think this is a great idea to do some sort of dramatic engagement, epistolary, or, you could do it talking into your phone or something like that. But we have to be careful with that, because there's this notion of venting. They sometimes call it the hydraulic theory of affects, and it turns out that, for some things that might be helpful, and it is helpful to figure out what you're angry about, to articulate it, but indulging it by ranting over and over again is often, it just makes the habits more strong, right? It makes it easier to then go off on people. But yeah, that would be cool if we had Mark Twain's other letters that he destroyed. What a great story.
Thank you. And email, they didn't have to deal with email, Greg. You're right about that. We need a whole new revamping, because you could, it's volatile, and that's why now you can unmail stuff.
Yeah.
Before, once you hit that send key, you could be in serious trouble, but now you can unmail, right?
Take moderator's privilege and give a practical tip. Don't put the name and the email address of the person.
Yeah.
When you're drafting. This way, if you accidentally hit send, it doesn't go anywhere. All right. Ashwini?
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, Greg, and it was very educational and interesting. And some of my work is also on anger and happiness, and I've tried to compare Stoics with the Bhagavad Gita. And as you said, like there's a lot of conversation in the religious texts as well, which is what we see in the Gita as well. So I have two brief questions. One is, where can I find Galen's conversation with Chrysippus that you mentioned? And the second question is, when you're working with your clients, do you ask them to choose a particular thinker to solve anger issues, or how do you choose what readings to give them?
Well, so the Galen, it's sort of an imaginary conversation, right? Chrysippus is long dead and he's just writing, and he's not really conversing with him in a dramatic sense of saying, well, if Chrysippus were here, he would be saying this or that. He just says, Chrysippus says in his text, here's this and that, and here's what I think he got wrong. And so it's just in his various works, Now, the question about the clients, sometimes they come to me, and we mentioned Stoicism. I would say that tends to be the more popular approach that some clients want to dig into, and that works just fine because we have available texts. Sometimes they'll just be at a loss and they'll be like, you give me anything that I can work with. My life is so screwed up in this respect of losing my temper. I'm happy to read anything. Although sometimes they'll also get angry at you in the therapy or the people they're reading, So, a lot of times they've already sort of dictated what they want to examine. And as I mentioned at the beginning too, oftentimes when it comes to business clients, I'm not going to tell them where the stuff comes from. I'll wait until they recognize some usefulness in it, and then I'll spring it on them. And usually I'll give them like little short sections, like 2 or 3 pages, rather than saying, hey, go read all of Seneca's on anger. So it very much depends on the individual client or the group that I'm working with. So hopefully that's a short enough, but enough of an answer, because we still have one.
Thank you.
And it is 2:00, so we're eating up part of our break time. But Caroline has to have her opportunity to ask you a question.
Oh, thank you. That's very nice. I'll try to make it brief, because I had a couple of points. First of all, as for the emotions being cognitive, that's ambiguous because people mean different things by that. And I think the most extreme view is the Stoics, because they simply reduce emotions to false beliefs. Well,
so they don't, though.
Straighten out your belief system and, fall into place. But, you have people, to stay with ancient philosophy, if you like, Plato, who does think that there's an effective notion, and that's, and the person in whom the laws governs, that's the lion in Book 9 of the Republic.
Yeah.
That's not cognitive. And that's precisely why we don't want Thumos to govern, and why these people are good warriors. They're like Achilles, they're filled with rage. That's their personality. But I'd also like just to ask you what you think about some of the work done in neuroscience, contemporary neuroscience, that shows a strong connection between the effective non-cognitive parts and rationality. Just starting with someone like Damasio, who everyone knows. But I think that it's a very complicated question, the role of reason. And something like anger, which, their emotions have intentionality, they have an object. Although, in my opinion, sometimes the person feeling the emotion or having the emotion doesn't know who it's directed at. But so it seems to me that I'd be interested to hear how you, parse out these various ideas about, what it means for an emotion to be cognitive and how people present them differently, because they're very different. idea about how emotions are cognitive is very different from, say, Seneca's.
Yeah. So the first thing is, I don't say that any of them say that emotions are cognitive. I say that they have a cognitive aspect. And the Stoics definitely do believe that there's an affective aspect to the emotions. You can see that in the discussions of the emotions in Seneca and in the two, sort of compendiums of Stoic doctrine that we have in Diogenes Laertes and Arius Didymus. So I would say that, they think that there's more of the judgment and belief involved, say, than some of the others do. But let me answer the other questions, because I do want to keep us on track.
To clear one thing up, and then the whole point of Stoic teaching and the reason they thought their work was so valuable is because it would lead to the dissolution of that affective aspect. So if you're angry and you can see the belief underlying it is false, then you achieve apatheia, literally.
Well, yes and no. They have the eupatheia as well. So you're not affectless in apatheia. You're just trying to have more positive than negative emotions. Now, with the Plato thing, thumos is irrational, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't, involve reasoning at all.
No, it relates.
And this is very clear, particularly as we move away from Plato and into Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism in the whole tradition. So I don't think that the distance between these different schools is that vast. As the neuroscience thing, neuroscience in the present includes everything from really great, let's focus on the science stuff, to crazy pseudoscience and everything in between. So I always want to say, well, who's neuroscience? And so whenever I hear, well, neuroscience is proven or neuroscience shows, my attitude is usually one of suspicion. Which doesn't mean I rule it out, but it means that I need to see what's actually being claimed and what the basis for the claim is, and how extensive the study was, how artificial were the circumstances. And this is where we get to the stuff where some people make claims like, well, we're never really reasoning, it's always rationalization. And I just don't buy that sort of stuff myself. So I don't have a good answer about the neuroscience stuff, but I would say with the Plato and Aristotle and Stoics that they're much closer. And this is reflected in the fact that these later authors often, like Plutarch, often have no trouble, even while being serious critics of the Stoics, drawing in whatever's useful from them. They're compatible. They're viewed as compatible with each other, at least on some of these matters.
All right. Well, thank you once again.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Rick.
Lou.
Thank you, Rick and Greg. Take 10 minutes, or now it's 9. We reconvene. We'll welcome Shanti at 2:15, okay? Take a short break, everyone. Thanks again, Greg. That was fantastic.
Oh, thank you. Thank all of you.